Hey, Soul. Can you help me with something?
What?
Can you ask me, what's the most important thing in comedy? Timing. Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran, here to wish you all, whether you're a chopped liver lover or a challah skala, Shana Tova. May you be inscribed and sealed in the book of life for a good and sweet new year. Let's face it, we could all use a little goodness and a little sweetness right now. So, although I don't have any formal power, apart from being a minister in the Universal Life Church, it's $25 online, all major credit cards accepted, I do have an informal desire to make this Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, which is happening right now, available to anyone who's interested. You're all Jews in my book, if you want to be, for this limited time offer. Today's guest, comedian Jeff Cesario, not a Jew, but like me, he started out as a drummer, and like me, he came from Wisconsin, and like me, he spent much of his 20s playing local gigs around the Midwest, wedding bands, bar bands, parties, etc. But unlike me, much as I would have loved to, he made a switch away from music to stand-up comedy in his late 20s. And this was in the early 80s, during that stand-up comedy boom, when Yes?
Are you in the middle of it?
I'm in the middle of it, yeah.
I'm just going to close your door on mine because I want to use the sharpener again.
You're going to use the sharpener right now?
Yeah.
Ask me what the most important thing in sharpening is.
What's the most...
Timing. As I was saying, this was in the 80s during that stand-up comedy boom when comedians were becoming huge stars and stand-up was stepping up in the collective consciousness. And he spent the last 4 decades honing, mining, hustling, and writing. Some notable credits and associations, just to whet your appetite, include long stints with Dennis Miller and Gary Shandling as a writer and producer of their shows. Jeff really tells us a large part of his story in our conversation, so there's not much more that I need to tell you. However, I want to tell you that I've known Jeff for years, and for years he and I have chatted about the overlap between music and comedy, jazz and comedy in particular. The fact is that even this podcast, The Third Story, which is generally about music, although over time has become much broader, was heavily influenced by the kinds of interviews that I heard Mark Maron doing with comics, and it made me think that musicians and comics have similar lives and similar experiences. Over the years, I have splashed around a little in the shallow end of the pool, talking about where music and comedy overlap. I know that Conan O'Brien loves to talk about this, and that Fred Armisen managed to pivot also from being a drummer to comedy. Christopher Guest and Rob Reiner and a whole slew of others have explored this question. But I haven't really had a chance to have this kind of conversation before, and I'm so glad I got to have it with Jeff because his understanding of the jazz musician's worldview is highly honed, and he's also put in the real time as a comic. So this talk really sealed in some of those juices that I've been stewing in for so long. And along the way, we touched on some especially deep ideas, including what Jeff describes as the power of insulation, that is, coming from a small scene, and how he approaches his stand-up act like a big band chart. Also, he talks about the double-edged sword of having a lot of experience in today's world, and that old chestnut, the intense value of commitment. Jeff's new stand-up album, What Was I Thinking, is out now and available in all the places you find all the albums that you listen to. And his podcast, Play with Pain with Chet Waterhouse, is also available in all the podcast places, and it's incredibly funny. Third-story.com is the place for you to go to do your research on this podcast. Sign up, subscribe, click the socials, write me a love letter, peruse the archive, including previous conversations that scratch the surface of this same kind of thinking, including talks with Professor Jeremy Dauber, author of the book Jewish Comedy, or check this one out, multi-instrumentalist jazzman George Colligan on his brief stint as a stand-up comedian. Or even, why not, my recent talk with drummer Jochen Ruckert, who is just a very absurd and funny cat. Once you're sufficiently excited by all that, then you make your way over to Patreon and put some quarters in the machine. That's patreon.com/thirdstorypodcast, and you can support this project at any level. Or, if you prefer not to exchange any money, you could simply pop onto the Apple Podcast app or Spotify and leave a review. Let the good people know how you feel about these quality conversations. Speaking of which, here's me and Jeff Cesario talking it down. Jeff Cesario, I just did your podcast 20 minutes ago, and I think I mispronounced your name in the middle of it because I think I've been pronouncing it with the traditional Italian Cesario, but it's kind of a more Americanized, long, brighter A. Cesario.
Yeah, it can be pronounced either way. Either sounds great. I tend to say Cesario just because it sounds less ethnic, which, in this day and age, not a bad thing.
Right. I mean, I think the pronunciation of your name is the byproduct of growing up in Wisconsin.
That's true. Yeah, that weird combination. Southeastern Wisconsin was the north end of the Rust Belt. And so there was a lot of ethnic groups there. There were Kenosha was 25% Italian when I was growing up.
Yeah.
Now, Racine had a lot of Italians, a lot of Polish people, a lot of German people. So it was sort of heavily that corner of the state. But then you go anywhere else, and, it's pretty much just Swedish farmers.
The two things I knew about Kenosha really in my life, not the sort of historical relationship that it had to as you say, the Rust Belt and the kind of on the way up from Chicago, and it was industrialized. But I knew that there were Italians there and musicians there, and most of the musicians were Italian.
Yes, there was a lot of good musicians in Kenosha and Racine.
Yeah,
and you're right, a lot of them were Italian. There was the first phase there was a lot of just good musicians there, and they played wedding bands, and they played dance gigs, and they played clubs, and there was a lot of really good players, and there were 3 or 4 really, quite frankly, top-notch accordion players. You just don't get that much anymore.
No, you don't get that anywhere.
The second phase there was a lot of good teachers there. You would have these great teachers who then taught not only privately, but in the public schools as well. And both cities, and particularly Kenosha, for a long time had a really strong public school music program across the board, junior high, high school, whatever it was. And there were some unbelievable musicians coming out of Kenosha. I mean, to this day, 2 of the top call trumpet players here in Los Angeles are from Kenosha. One of the guys who wound up teaching and now he's in administration at Berkeley's from Kenosha, Jay Kennedy, and Steve Houghton, who's one of the best drummers in the world, who is just finishing up teaching at the University of Indiana, which is a great school. He's from Kenosha. Like one of the principal oboists at the Chicago Symphony was from Kenosha. I mean, they just went far and wide. And then you look at the tentacles and you go, how did that happen? How did this little blue-collar town of 60,000 people have so many really good musicians? Well, it was just there was good music in the communities, and then they translated it to good teachers. And boy, that made all the difference.
Similarly, I think to what happened in Minnesota and Minneapolis is that combination of good teachers, maybe a talent pool that's large enough that it inspires new young musicians to get involved, and then also that Midwestern good work ethic, right? And not to aspire to too much either, just to be in the community and make good music. It was enough for a lot of people, I think. Yeah,
Minneapolis was phenomenal that way in the sense that there were so many great musical styles going on in Minneapolis. We ID it with the Minneapolis sound, with Prince and the Minneapolis sound and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis and all of that, which was unbelievable. But at the same time, there was Husker Du was playing, and there were some unbelievable rock and roll bands out of Minneapolis as well, and great classical players. And that city was big enough to have exactly what you're talking about. They had a scene, but small enough to not only be able to incorporate the work ethic, but I think there's an insulation there that works to the musician's advantage, works to the artist's advantage, because it translated to comedy too. And right when Minneapolis was getting hot musically, it got hot comedically too. I moved up there to start comedy in the early 80s. And boy, I wound up working with, again, small but mighty group of people, almost a duplication of what I went through in Kenosha on a smaller scale in terms of musicians. In comedy, the group in Minneapolis was maybe 20 all total, really, of dedicated professional comedians. But that included Louis Anderson, who's gone on to incredible stardom. Included Liz Winstead, who created The Daily Show and is a tremendous stand-up in her own right. It included Joel Madison, who went on to write for Roseanne and created Malcolm and Eddie. It includes Sid Youngers, who wrote for Roseanne and is now writing for Tim Allen's show Last Man Standing and is a tremendous producer, writer. There's people, Joel Hodgson, who created Mystery Science Theater 3000 and is essentially a genius, a performance artist genius. That's 5 people right there. Yeah. And I'm missing people. There's tremendous power in insulation sometimes because it allows you to just keep creating. And especially back then, you could make mistakes without anybody seeing you. There were no iPhones. So you could completely screw up a stand-up gig and there was no evidence of it anywhere. Well, so you learned your lessons,
Right. Yeah, I felt that way when I lived in Madison before I moved to New York. Also, it's a great place to take chances and to work your thing out because the stakes are not so terribly high. I mean, they're high around your peers and your compatriots or whatever, but it's not going to, there's not going to be some critic from the Times who's sitting in the back table who's going to, potentially destroy your career or, get you a deal or whatever.
Or it's not going to wind up on YouTube or Twitter in front of 12 million people.
So have you seen that as a real shift in the way people work out their craft now, that you have to be careful because anybody could be recording it?
Yes. It's interesting. I had a conversation with 2 younger comics not too long ago. Another great comic out of Minneapolis, Nicholas Anthony, and Al Jackson is a tremendous comic out here. And Nick and Al were saying, we were bringing up things that from the not too distant past. And I was saying, Chris Rock's classic bits from his breakthrough solo album, which is within the last 20 years, could not be done nowadays. You couldn't do them. You'd get caught up in too many hashtags. You'd get shut down by both audience, peers, bookers, and even agents and managers, which is kind of sad and a little bit scary. So yeah, I think young comics really have to kind of keep that in mind. The upside is there's so much technology now that I always like to describe it this way. When I was coming up, I was coming up in a time when the big end of the funnel was huge. Mm-hmm. Everybody wanted to be a stand-up in the early 80s and everybody was diving in. And the small end of the funnel was the Tonight Show. Yep. That was it for stand-up comedians. It was that small. You either got on the Tonight Show or you didn't, and that kind of made or broke your career. And there's an advantage to that in that you really know what the rules are, you know what you're up against. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, it's so diverse that the big end of the funnel is still as big, if not bigger. And but the bottom end of the it's more of a conical shape. Yeah. The bottom end of the funnel is almost as big as I mean, you can take your craft, in this case, comedy, you can take it anywhere. You could have a blog, you could have a podcast, you could have a streaming show, you could be on YouTube. There's so many places to take your comedy online, let alone in the more traditional forms which still exist. The comedy clubs. Now there's straight stand-up clubs. There's alternative stand-up clubs. There's improv clubs. There's sketch rooms. There's so many ways to take your comedy that the key now is go out. There's no more gatekeepers. There's no more Tonight Shows. There's no more anybody saying, here's what you have to do to get big. Now you just go, here's my brand. Who likes it? And if you get 100,000 people, you're in, man. Yeah. You've got your demo. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's really different. So hearing you talk about this, though, I get the sense that you've been in the world of comedy for so long, and you came through that first generation. It was really explosive. As you say, everybody was trying to get in. There was like a rush, to be in comedy. And younger comics probably see you as one of these godfathers of that generation. But before we even dive too deep into it, I also know that you started out as a musician and that you had to sort of like really make that transition. And I think you and I have been sort of flirting with this conversation for a few years on email. Oh man, we should talk about music and comedy and how they overlap and what's similar about them. And I have my thoughts about it, but you're so well positioned to talk about it because you started out your kind of young adult life as a musician and operating as a musician, and then you pivoted. So first, I guess I wanted, dig in a little bit to that period of when you were a musician and what that was like for you.
I really loved playing. I was not great at practicing, but I had the great good fortune to grow up with a lot of great musicians. A fellow named Steve Houghton in particular, tremendous drummer from my hometown of Kenosha, Wisconsin, who wound up going on to play with Woody Herman and the Tashiko Tobacco Big Band and Freddie Hubbard and on and on and on. Just unbelievable musicians, and top call studio guy when he lived in L.A., then took his talent to go teach at the University of Indiana, which is one of the top schools of music in the world.
And were you a jazz drummer, a rock drummer? What kind of drummer? Because you were a drummer,
I was
right?
A not great kit drummer.
Yeah.
That's how I would describe myself. Regardless of musical style, Leo, I was not great. I was solid. I could get through a gig without anybody turning around and going, hey, what's with the tempo sliding around?
Yeah.
I could get through that. I didn't have a lot of chops for fills or anything.
Yeah.
But the great thing for me was to be with a guy like Steve, and I could see not only the tremendous natural talent he had, but the great work ethic he had to get where he was going. And long story short, I would watch him take a lick he wanted to learn or something he wanted to get in his bones. And he would work it and work it and work it. And 45 minutes later, he'd have it. Huh. It would take me like 8-9 hours to get the same thing. And I didn't have it down nearly as good as he had it. And I thought, what do I have inside of me that I have an affinity for, where maybe there's some natural talent for me? And comedy kept popping up. I had always loved comedy since I was a kid, watching The Tonight Show and watching comics on The Tonight Show. And I had, at an early age, discovered that I could be pretty quick off the top of my head and that people liked me more when I was funny. And I was incredibly shy. And when I got to puberty, and it was just like, well, it's like the only tool I had to try to attract women, So I started to apply that a little bit on my own and wound up actually with Steve. Here's the overlap, doing great comedy duo routines for our high school variety show. Steve and I did Who's on First. Steve and I did an old Don Knotts, Bill Cosby duo thing, the chess game. We found an old vaudeville bit that we did ourselves. We wrote one ourselves, but there was always great timing between us. And that's the one thing that unites comedy with music is timing. Mm-hmm. The other musically, the first thing I did was go, okay, 4-way coordination, not my thing. Mm-hmm. That's clear. I could not handle the hi-hat doing something different than the bass. I just couldn't do it.
Yep.
And then the guys who can sing and play, what the hell is that all about? I could barely breathe and play at the same time. I'm in awe of like Phil Collins or somebody like that. So I went, okay, how about 2-way coordination? And I gravitated towards conga drums, which was another thing that as a kid, I just went, it was primal. It was like comedy in that sense. It was this primal thing from the pit of my stomach. When I heard conga drums, and the first time I heard it, I think was Tony Bennett live at the Latin Quarter in Philadelphia with the Count Basie Orchestra. Mm-hmm. And they had a whole Latin section with them, and they just ripped it up. And there was something so primal about the way conga drums sounded. I said, I got to try those, to the point where I made my own conga drums in high school until I had the money to buy them. And that's what I played mostly from then on through college. And then I had some experience as a professional musician. I played congas and Latin hand percussion and enjoyed the hell out of it and really enjoyed it. And then finally, the other little primal gorilla inside my stomach just went, the alien being said, I got to get out. And that was comedy. And I started late. I was literally 28 when I started stand-up comedy.
Had you been in Madison before you were in Madison for a while, right?
I was in Madison to go to school.
Yep.
Then I stayed in Madison about 5 years after I graduated. And I played around town and did gigs. Yeah. And I worked with Clyde, who I know you worked with, Clyde Stubblefield, the great Clyde Stubblefield.
Sure.
And I worked with John Northrup on guitar. and I worked with Peter Dominguez on bass, and I
Yeah.
worked with so many great
Sure.
musicians there, and I had a great time playing around town. And then I did some arranging and composing, and I did a session for a singer named Ikel Pierre, and I used a bunch of musicians from Milwaukee and Madison, and we had a great time. And then I thought, okay, by 1980, I said, I'm not sure where this goes, but I know I can play weddings in Minneapolis as well as I can play weddings in Madison. So I know I can make a living. And I had some musical contacts up in Minneapolis, including the Peterson brothers. So I thought, okay, I could probably cobble together enough gigs to make money. And Minneapolis had a burgeoning little comedy scene, and I felt comfortable there. So I said, let me go try comedy.
Was the Kentucky Fried Theater scene in Madison in the 70s, was that just before you were on the scene?
It was just before, but I wound up getting to know Pat Proft through my Minneapolis connections. And Pat was the Minneapolis guy who coupled up with Abrams and the Zucker brothers.
Right.
And did all those incredible movies from Airplane through the Top Gun
Right.
parody through all of that stuff.
But that wasn't
So
something that you saw here. That wasn't something that you caught here.
I did see it there. Yeah. I caught the tail end of Kentucky Fried Theater in Madison. Yeah. I caught the very tail end of it. And I saw Groove Tube there, which was a fellow named Ken Shapiro, which was really the first sort of sketch movie based on guys who smoked pot a lot. So it was just these short sketches, but it was revolutionary at the time. And between that and Kentucky Fried Theater, which then became Kentucky Fried Movie, which then became Abrams, Zucker, and Proft, and they just killed it out here. So I overlapped a very little bit with that, but I really, found that musicians are extremely funny people.
Yes.
Just the funniest people and the most relaxed people, generally speaking. And even the uptight ones, knowingly or not, are hilarious. And that kind of encouraged me.
This is a question I have had. Sometimes I wonder if musicians are funnier in the room and comics are, funnier on stage, in the sense that I think musicians love to kind of tell the in-jokes and the war stories to each other, and love to laugh at the bar. And, I've often wondered, does that carry over to comics, or are comics, as you describe yourself, more introverted? Not that you can categorize an entire field, but are they the same kind of people?
I think they are, bottom line.
Yeah.
I think it changes as you get into the finer points of psychology.
Yeah.
There tends to be a loner quality to stand up because you're doing everything yourself.
Yeah.
On stage, you're producing, you're writing, you're performing, you're directing. That isolation can create some unusual personality traits. And of course, what draws people to comedy over music can be different. The way you're growing up, whatever environment you grew up in, there can be a preponderance of pain.
Yes.
In the case of comics, that maybe less so in the case of musicians, or different in the case of musicians. So there's an isolation in comedy, and there is a togetherness, a group quality to music that doesn't often exist in comedy. And really, in a weird way, it's the thing I miss the most, and the thing I've always looked for and tried to recreate in comedy, whether I was behind the camera doing executive producing and head writing and a lot of that kind of stuff. And when I got in those positions, I tried to create a writer's room that felt relaxed and comfortable and wasn't fear-based and was joy-based, was based on the creative process, so that guys, and when I say guys, again, men and women, writers who could get loose in those rooms, be themselves, and create. And I approached it more like a musician, more like a baseball manager, if you will. I never assigned one thing to one guy. Okay, you see everything through on this bit until it gets on television. I was always more like, okay, you're good at writing it. This other guy's good at finding the graphics for it. And this third guy's really good at editing it. Why don't you make a little team, knock it out, have some fun, and we'll probably have a better product. So that was sort of my approach, which I believe I got from music. There's no doubt. The communal property of music is fantastic.
Right. I get that. I hear that. I mean, I suppose that's where sketch and music ensemble playing maybe overlap a little more in that way, right? Like the sketch comics who are kind of form teams together are kind of like playing in bands.
Yeah, there's a definite quality to improvisational comedy that parallels music more closely.
Yeah.
First and foremost, the difference between improv and stand-up is you got to listen in improv. In stand-up, you don't really listen. You do if you're working the crowd, if you're asking questions and stuff. You do nowadays, in the last 20 years, part of what makes alternative comedy is that stand-up comics incorporated listening and being in the moment, at least, as much as they do in music, which did not used to necessarily be a part of stand-up comedy. And that's, I think, one of the things that defines alternative comedy. And then sketch comedy, yeah, there are certain ground rules like there are in a tune. They might be very generalized. We're going to work over these chords and that's it. In improv, here's the basic rules and that's it. Sometimes it's very specific and you've got an actual chart, if you will, and you kind of have to follow that. And then there's moments of improv. I always approach my stand-up act like a big band chart. There was going to be written out sections, and then there was going to be sections where I soloed. And I knew where those were, and I knew what the chart was every night going into the show. And unless I was flying and I felt an energy from the crowd that triggered me to just go completely off the page for large chunks of time, I would pretty much stick to the chart, knowing, all right, I'm going to hit these bits here, open the show, then I'm going to kind of go off the page and solo, then I'm going to come back and hit these bits here. And that's kind of how I approached my act. That's one of the things I took from music and applied to stand-up was sort of the structure of it and the energy in the field.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I remember Lenny Bruce said later, you know, in one of his later records, that, you know, he said, on a really good night, I might be improvising 10% of my act. And of course, my understanding of Lenny was, he was a real improviser. And he's saying, you know, it's got to be really popping for me to take a risk and improvise more than 10% of the act. So I got that sense early on that, you know, improvisation when it comes to comedy is not like you go out and just open your mouth. I mean, maybe some people do. I know Mark Maron was sort of notorious for doing that kind of thing. But like most people have a chart, have some kind of a roadmap that they're going to follow.
And I think even Mark would probably tell you he had a roadmap. Most nights, he's going to have a roadmap. He is a great writer of stand-up. And he also is, his style is uber conversational. So even when he's doing a written bit, it sounds so conversational that, you know, you can't tell off the top if he is just talking or if it is a bit. And that's kind of the beauty of the style he's carved out for himself. There are guys who write on stage. Louis Anderson was a great example of a guy who would just get up, work the crowd, find ideas from different people, riff on them. Sinbad was another guy who could do that. There are guys who write on stage and make laughs like pretty quickly out of the ingredients they get, tape it, go back, study it, and then go, this is a bit I can now put in my act as a permanent bit. The thing I riffed about small town weddings with that old lady who was in the back and the young guy who was in the front, now I got a bit. So there are very few people who can actually do it. There are people who can write on stage. One of the great lessons I had in comedy was when I first got to Los Angeles. I'm standing in the back of the room at the Comedy Store, and they introduced Richard Pryor. And the original room at the Comedy Store is very small. The hallway behind it is very small. And I see Pryor, he literally, within a foot of me, just blows by and goes up on stage to a standing ovation. This is maybe a year after his first seminal stand-up album, still maybe the greatest live stand-up album of all time, Richard Pryor Live and in Concert. And he is now working on the next one, which was, I believe, Richard Pryor Live on Sunset Strip. So he goes up on stage to a standing ovation. People are, the roof's blown off the joint, literally. He goes up and he works, Leo, for 10 minutes without a laugh. Without a laugh. He's just pounding new material. And he doesn't even have the time, if you're headlining on the road, to go, okay, I'll open with 20 tried and true stuff. Then I'll do 10 new stuff. Then I'll go back and do 10 old stuff. I'll slip in another 15 new stuff. I'll work this stuff over 6 months. He didn't have the time. He was so hot. They wanted another special within 9 months. He didn't have the luxury. He was going up doing wall to wall new material, new premises, trying to remember bits while at the same time writing on stage, because he was another brilliant guy who could write on stage. And he got nothing for 10 minutes, and he's pounding, just going to the body, pounding. And finally, he stopped, and I mean, the audience is like dead quiet. And he just stopped and he went, I know you want to hear the old drunk guy. You want to hear that character? Well, I did that character on my last special, and I got another special staring me in the eye, and I got to write some new motherfucking material.
Yeah.
So we're going to keep at this. And he just went right back to it.
Yeah.
And I just went, I don't know where you get stones that big.
Yeah.
And I went, wow, this is something I never, ever saw before. And it was really a tremendous lesson to learn, to stick to your guns. I still have an incredible trouble with that kind of commitment. I marvel at the guys who just go up there, the comics, I should say, men and women, with just unbelievable commitment. Roseanne was like that. Jim Carrey, where you go, boy, this bit is 110% commitment.
Yes.
He isn't backing off after the first line doesn't quite work. He's just in it. It's amazing.
As you know, I live in New York. I'm in Wisconsin right now visiting my parents. I'm sitting in this room. My dad is a musician, of course, and he's got this room filled with records and posters. And there's this poster on the wall next to me, right? And it's from the Montreux International Jazz Festival of 1978. The poster is Pharoah Sanders, Mulhall, Richard Abrams, the Brecker brothers, and Ben Sidran. The thing that jumped out at me when I saw that on the wall the other day was there's room for all kinds. You know what I mean? There's room for each one. Each one of those acts is like a totally unique, stylized thing. They have very little actually stylistically in common with one another, but they all were on the same marquee. And I think it's because they all had a certain like level of identity and commitment in the musical zone. And what you're describing in terms of finding your voice in comedy is very similar, that everybody that you describe is somebody who had just total commitment to the thing that they're doing.
Yeah. Another great lesson I learned early in my time after spending 3 years in Minneapolis, I moved to California. And, you learn quickly that if you, when you're working the improv or you're working the comedy store back then, those were the two big clubs in town. Especially if you were young and new, you would get bumped a lot. First of all, you had to work your ass off just to get into the club. It could be a year, 2 year, 3 year
of doing what? What were you doing to try to get a spot? What would you have to do? Just show up? You would
have to try to get somebody to kind of put in a good word with you, with either Bud Friedman or Mitzi Shore. Bud at the Improv, Mitzi at the Comedy Store. And then you would have to go up and do a showcase night in front of Mitzi or Bud, and they would have to listen to you and go, okay, he's good enough to be a non-paid regular, and then we'll see if he becomes a paid regular. So there were these steps you had to go through, and you just do it, and you just get in and go through. I got in at the Improv more quickly because they were a more monologist-friendly club. The store was a more personality-generated club. But the great thing about that was either room, especially as a newer comic, on any given night, you were going to get bumped by bigger names. Famous people would walk in at virtually any time between 7:30 p.m. and 2 a.m. and walk right up on stage and do a set and bump you down or bump you out. And that was just the rules of the game. So on any given night, you would have to follow Robin Williams at the height of his power, literally. And then boom, 3/4 of the room walks when Robin's done. And then you got to go on. Now, your initial instinct is, how do I keep this energy? How do I create this? And it's almost counterintuitive, but it's true. You can't do that. It forces you to be yourself. Or you wind up being desperate on stage, trying to capture the energy of the last performer and keep that audience there. And you can't. You just have to go on and be whoever the hell it is you are. And it forces you to be whoever the hell it is you are. And eventually, even if, like, I didn't catch on for a while, eventually I realized, it doesn't, I can't change my material. I can deliver with more energy or less energy, but so what? Why don't I deliver it with the energy I want to deliver it with? And they'll buy it or they won't buy it. They're going to buy it or not buy it anyway. So I may as well stay inside myself and be comfortable in my style. And that really forced you to do it. Boy, when you're following massive stars, Roseanne or Tim Allen or any of those level people who were pounding it, crushing it when I was coming up. It really gave you the discipline to learn how to just be who you are and stay in your lane.
Now, I heard a story now this is back when you were in Minneapolis, of when you're starting to transition from music to comedy, which I can imagine at any time in your life in any city would have been wherever you are, whatever's going on, you just got to do it one day. You just got to put your hand up in the air and go, now I'm doing comedy. But I've heard some stories about the early gigs, one in particular in which you played at a jazz club, that you were working music venues because those were where your relationships were. Yeah,
that was the first opening gig I ever did was Ben Sidran. Was your dad.
Yeah.
At a club out on 494, out on what they affectionately referred to as the Strip in Minneapolis. I had been working a couple of local clubs, so I had some material. I had a little bit of legs underneath me, but I wanted to start branching out and doing other stuff. And again, the great thing about a market like that is a small but mighty pool of comedians is that if you're desirous, you can go out and hustle up gigs like that. Mm-hmm. And guys were getting gigs. Guys were getting VFW halls and private gigs. And that was, and there wasn't a lot of quality comics in town. The ones that were there were good. So everybody was working.
Yeah.
I mean, I was getting 2.5 hours of stage time, Leo, a week, which was, I was a year into stand-up. I was getting 2.5 hours a week. That's a lot of dues. You can make a lot of mistakes in a very short period of time. And like we said, back then, nobody iPhoned it and slapped it up on TikTok. You could make a crap load of mistakes and nobody saw me. You could just go, okay, if I learn from those, I'll be better the next time.
Yes.
So one of the things I tried to do, because I had contacts mostly in jazz and sort of jazz fusion, and there were rooms that were working that kind of music, and I just bothered Billy and Ricky Peterson until they went to Ben and said, and I knew Ben a little bit from Madison because I had been bothering him back then as a musician. And so we were just doing this gig, and it was at a beautiful club up maybe 6 stories. So you had a nice view of the sunset, and, it was great. And I said, hey man, can you mind if I do 10 minutes in front of you? I'll open for you. And he was gracious enough to say yes. And I don't remember the gigs. I mean, fortunately, it was, I was completely blinded by whatever I was doing. Anytime, as you may recall, whether it's music or comedy, your first couple of years, it's just a blind rush. So I have zero recollection of what material I did or anything. I do believe I got laughs. I do believe because I had some material about having been a musician, I did a run, which incidentally I do a version of on my very first album, which I just released. I'd never done an album in 40 years of stand-up until this month. It's called
What Was I Thinking?
Yeah. And I did it kind of as a tribute to those days, but I do a whole thing about, I played in a wedding band, and literally, you have to play everything in a wedding band, especially in Wisconsin. You got to, guys come by. Hey, guys, know any AC/DC?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we'll do Highway to Hell right after we finish the Hokey Pokey.
You got to know it all. It's true. But, I didn't laugh that hard because it just felt more like PTSD when I heard it.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So I had a little 5-minute chunk on music, and that always, at the very least, endeared me to music audiences. And then I had a couple of bits that I knew worked by the time I did that. So I managed to get through 10 in a complete adrenaline rush. And I think it was 2 shows. And that experience, which was so generous of Ben and the guys to let me do that, helped me. Within probably 6 months, I opened for John Prine down in Rochester, which was another unbelievable experience. And then I was the first local guy to open for big touring acts at the Carlton Celebrity Room, which is long gone, but it was the sort of Vegas showroom in the Twin Cities area. And they never used locals. And I finally broke the ice, and I did Kool and the Gang and Gladys Knight and the Pips and the Commodores all out at Carlton Celebrity Room. And part of the reason I did better at those gigs was because I had experience from opening for Ben and opening for John Prine and getting gigs like that. So there were those kind of gigs around. And suddenly I moved out to LA under 3 years. I only spent 2.5 to 2 3/4 years in Minneapolis and then moved to LA.
Huh.
But when I moved to LA, I was already headlining smaller rooms around the Midwest.
Yes.
I'd opened for big name music acts. I had that level of experience. I wasn't thrown on stage easily. I had dealt with hecklers, so I knew what my muscles were there. I had some experience.
So, as opposed to if you had moved straight to LA, it sounds like the experience would have been much different. You wouldn't have been able to pay those dues so quickly as you did by stopping in Minneapolis on your way.
Oh, exactly. I mean, the guys in LA were getting anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes of stage time a week. And sometimes even the really good comics would get 3, 4, 5 sets a week. New York was different. There were 5 or 6 stand-up rooms, but weirdly enough, a smaller pool of comics. So really good comics in New York could get 3, 4 sets a night. So they could still patch together a lot of stage time in a week. In LA, that just didn't exist. And there weren't even that many peripheral gigs. It's hard to find stage time out here.
Why did you choose the West Coast as opposed to the East Coast? You had to go one way or the other. Why did you go West?
I had in the back of my head the desire to write and maybe write funny TV or write funny movies and with some luck be in them. Mm-hmm. And I just thought it would be a better stretch if I went there. It would be a more direct line. Plus, quite honestly, from a personal, emotional place, I even do a line on it. I look very Italian. Mm-hmm. And most people assume I am from New York. Mm-hmm. And then, Leo, you talk to me for 2 minutes and you go, oh, this guy, he couldn't survive 3 days in New York. He'd be stripped naked and be sitting in a jail with a Mormon family who got robbed. I don't have the guile. I don't have the streetwise common sense to survive. I'm a nice Wisconsin guy on that end of things. Mm-hmm. So I was always a little petrified of New York. I loved going there. I loved the adrenaline rush. I loved going there for 2 or 3 weeks and crashing on my brother's floor in his studio apartment and hitting the clubs and trying to make things happen. But living there, by the time I was comfortable living in New York, I'd already made it to a degree. I was doing Letterman and doing The Tonight Show and doing gigs. And I thought, if a gig brings me to New York, if a writing or producing gig does and I'm making money, I would move by then. But it took me 10 years to warm up, to really think, okay, I can handle New York. Mm-hmm. LA was different. LA, there's so many spots of LA that feel very Midwest to me. There's also a Paris quality to the city. There's 9 downtowns.
Yeah.
And if you find the right one that you're comfortable with, you can just go live there.
Yeah. But you say this thing about, I'm a nice Midwestern guy. Anybody who talks to you for 5 minutes, I agree. I mean, I would know that you were from somewhere near where I'm from or Chicago to hearing you talk, that's
right.
Pretty clear. But, LA is its own kind of snake pit. It just masquerades as something a little sweeter, but it is a jungle in its own way.
Yeah.
When you did move to LA from Minneapolis and you learned how to negotiate, was it a culture shock for you? What was it like to have to figure out how to operate in that universe?
Wow, that's a great question. You just have to keep moving forward. I knew that my strength was my writing, my jokes. Mm-hmm. And I was super fortunate in this sense. And I believe it's still true to an extent. But comedy was kind of the Wild West back mm-hmm. then. It was the last place a gunslinger could mm-hmm. live comfortably. If you could write funny jokes, that would get recognized by talented, funny people who would then want to hire you because they want to be funny, or they have a show and they need muscle. They mm-hmm. need people. So it was still more merit-based than perhaps other areas of life and other areas of show business. And it took me a long time to realize that being merit-based is just not life. that merit is always going to be an element of the top 3 or 4 or 5 things that you need in life to live, but that at times merit will slide down from 1 to 5, or it'll just sit at 3 or 4 for a long time. And your ability to network will be important. Your ability to be an effective communicator with people will be important. Your contacts will be important. Your political savvy, for lack of a better term. How do I handle rooms? How do I understand other people? Just basic human communication I lacked because I grew up in a family that really didn't do that. I got into a business that you could do everything by yourself. And if you were funny, club owners would still want you. So the simple notion of sitting down with people to talk and being comfortable listening and talking was foreign to me. So I would kind of shrink into my own shell, which everywhere was perceived as standoffishness or even arrogance, especially out here. New York was the one place where it was instantly recognized. I will never forget going to Catch a Rising Star. I'd been in LA for a while. I was trying to get a Letterman audition, and just standing in the corner of Catch a Rising Star. And Louis Ferranda, who went on to run Caroline's, which is one of the great rooms in the country, was a bartender at Catch. And when the show started, all the comics went into the room, and I was just still standing there like a dope in the corner. And he just looked at me and he went, you want a drink? And I said, oh, I'd love a drink. And he gave me a beer, and I realized that tonally, I was maybe a New York comic, and I just had to allow my emotional makeup to kind of catch up. But that helped relax me to realize, okay, there are some people who understand that this is just who I am. So yeah, this can be a complete snake pit, and you really have to understand it. But I was so fortunate. I met Dennis Miller almost right away, and he was nobody when we met. We just completely hit it off. We were opposite sides of the same coin. He was a little more edgy and darker, and I was a little more pleasant in my stuff. But we wrote jokes almost identically. Our approach to writing was almost identical. Our approach to the craft was identical. The way we handled ourselves on stage was very close. And we just became fast friends. And he's from Pittsburgh, and I'm from Kenosha. I mean, we're both kind of old school Rust Belt guys. And we probably both hid inside ourselves through a lot of our adolescence. So we bonded. And then within a short period of time, Dennis wound up doing an SNL auditioning, catching on in 85. And we remained fast friends. And he just respected me because he loved the way I wrote a joke. And then when he was on SNL doing Update, back then they didn't have any writers dedicated to writing Update jokes. Dennis was writing his whole thing. So I would send him jokes from the road. I would go, this joke about the Russian government is dead in 10 days anyway, Denny. You may as well take it. It worked tonight at Charlie Goodnight's in Raleigh, North Carolina. It worked. Why don't you take it? So he would occasionally slip in jokes that I wrote for him, and it solidified our friendship. And through him, I met Gary Shandling, who is a genius and an unbelievably sweet guy, the late, great Gary Shandling. And he gravitated towards me because Dennis said, this guy can write a joke. Then I wrote some jokes. I'll never forget the first time it happened. If you've got time.
I got nothing but time.
Gary was guest hosting The Tonight Show, and Denny would always help him write. Whenever Gary guest hosted The Tonight Show, this is back when Johnny would take a week off. And Gary Shandling and Jay Leno would alternate the weeks. And on his weeks, Gary Shandling and Dennis Miller shared the same manager, Brad Gray at the time, who only had a few clients and then wound up becoming, the president of show business before he passed away. And so Denny would come and help Gary write. And Dennis was already doing SNL, so he had, but he had just loved writing. And Gary was a magnanimous human being, had come from writing. He had started as a writer. So he always treated writers with great respect. So he would take everything that Tonight Show writers could provide. He would take everything from 3 or 4 other sources that he would provide, and he would have Dennis come on. They got stuck on a setup. This was back when Tammy Faye Baker had a talk show. And the setup was Tammy Faye Baker was taking some time off from her talk show and was getting some guest hosts. They had a setup. They had no punchline. I get this call one day. I'm just sweating in my unair-conditioned apartment in Studio City. And it's Dennis. And he goes, "Hey, Jeff, bro, I'm with Gary Shandling. We're stuck on this joke. Here's the setup. Tammy Faye Baker's got our own talk show. She's going to have guest hosts. And we don't have a punchline. Call me back if you think anything." Click. He hangs up. So typical me, it's not like it comes flying off the top of my head. I just sit down and sweat work at the typewriter for 5 minutes. I come up with 5 lines. I pick the best one. I call him back. I go, "Danny, how about this? Tammy Faye Baker has this talk show. She's taking a vacation. She's going to have guest hosts. They chose Joan Rivers because that way they don't have to change makeup, ladies." A simple, dumb joke. Gary liked it. Gary used it. It worked. From then on, Gary said, "When I'm guest hosting the Tonight Show, have Jeff come in with you." So I started going in and writing with Gary and Dennis. And then from that, Gary and I started to do some stand-up dates together. He was gracious enough to let me open for him. And then that led into doing some writing it led into a friendship, first and foremost. And then that led into writing for a monologue for Larry Sanders' show. And then through that, I wound up writing for the Larry Sanders Show, actually writing scripts. So it was so merit-based, Leo, that I was incredibly fortunate. I got to a fairly high degree of success based on merit, and that allowed the incredibly lagging emotional makeup of me to kind of catch up enough where once I got behind the camera, I knew how to try to run a room. And
that's the other thing that I understood. I remember as a young man, high school age maybe, visiting L.A. with my parents, and we went to a taping of the Dennis Miller show that you were producing, I think. You were working as a producer, and also with Larry Sanders. I know that you worked as a producer on the show.
It's glorified writer to an extent. Most writers on sitcoms, they also call producers because you are also producing. You're responsible for certain elements of the production of your script. You have to pull together coordinating with the production staff, sometimes a wardrobe, sometimes the physical layout of where a scene is going to take place. So you get into those elements and you actually do some producing. There are people over you who coordinate all that production. But you do some producing in sitcoms. In talk variety, which Dennis Miller Show was, I was executive producer because Denny had a syndicated regular sort of talk show that had gone south, and he was, adrift until HBO came in and said, actually he told Brad Gray, Michael Fuchs, who headed HBO at the time, went to Brad Gray and said, "We love Dennis's ranting, even though his talk show didn't go. Can we do something with that?" And they cooked up a talk show deal for HBO. They were going to give Dennis 6. And Dennis just came to me one day and he said, "Jeff, probably you want to executive produce my show? I don't trust anybody else." So I went, "I'd love to." I had no idea what I was doing. None. But I knew Dennis and I knew the freedom that HBO gave. And we were so fortunate. We had great executives from Michael to Bridget Potter to Carolyn Strauss. And these people said, "Do what you do. Whatever it is, we're not going to interfere."
Yeah.
So Dennis and I got to design the show like a glove around Dennis. And again, based almost entirely on merit. And believe me, now, having been on that side of the camera another 25 years, I can only imagine the conversations that were going on between HBO and Brad Gray going, "Look, Cesario's a nice kid. But can we get a producer in there?
Can we have an adult in the room, please?" Yeah.
And to everybody's credit, they stuck to their guns. And what helped us was we earned it after the first 2 shows, especially the second show, which I had a lot of influence on. The first show, there were other folks in the room who were exerting influence, and it didn't come out as good as Dennis wanted. Dennis came to me and he said, "Jeff, we got to have jokes." And we just kind of changed up. And our guest was Jim Carrey. And that second show went through the roof. And we won an Emmy for that show. And we got a great review from the New York Times. So on merit, we earned the reviews and then hence the numbers that helped HBO go, "Okay, this is working."
Yes.
So we got lucky.
And with Larry Sanders, I think time has really proven that show was a revolutionary thing. It was like a real transitional kind of show in so many ways, in the tone of it and the way that it had a one foot in what we now feel is a sort of handheld reality kind of feel of a show. Also, the meta look at any kind of business, but particularly show business within the frame of being a part of show business. It was a commentary and it was also entertainment at the same time. Did you have any feeling? Was there an energy around that show that this is like a really special thing? Was it just another gig? What did it feel like to work on that show?
I was super fortunate. There was an energy around both of my first two television experiences, which was Dennis Miller Live and then Larry Sanders, that something special was happening. With Dennis Miller Live, nobody in talk variety had ever really tailored a show specifically around a guy's strengths. I remember talking to Peter LaSalle, who produced both The Tonight Show and Letterman, to get some advice. And he said, just do what your host does well. If he hits the curveball, just pitch him curveballs. You're in a position at HBO, you don't have to pitch him any other pitches. Pitch him curveballs. And I took that to heart. And Peter LaSalle, I owe a great deal to, because he was always a calming influence. And we did that with Dennis Miller Live. And I think that paved the way for the Daily Shows and the Bill Maher's and any other show that was kind of built around a comedy. Now, clearly the Daily Show had its own groove as well, because it was essentially a parody of a news show. But I think there's elements to a lot of shows that have happened since Dennis Miller that you can trace back to Dennis Miller. Sure. And we were fortunate in the sense that we became the first non-network talk variety show to beat a network series in a major category, which was best writing. We were also very fortunate in that in our show the writing was right there. We wrote it, Dennis read it right into camera. Dennis improv'd off it right into camera. So it was all writing. And the Emmy committee saw it that way. And we were a huge surprise. I mean, I'll never forget the late, great Phil Hartman's face, who was the presenter. They're listing The Tonight Show and Letterman and whoever else, and then us. That's back when cable had its own award show, the Ace Awards. So nobody expected a cable show to beat a network show at the Emmys. And Phil opened that envelope and read it, and his eyebrows went up before he said anything. And I went, oh, my God. And then he said, it's the staff from Dennis Miller Live. And we won, and that was the first time a cable series had beaten a network series in a major category. And 4 years later, no Ace Awards. Everything's the Emmys. And cable's winning Emmys hand over fist. So I'm really proud of that we were able to put on a great quality show. And I'm very thankful to HBO and to Dennis Miller for letting that happen. So that was unique. And then Denny won. I mean, I stayed with the show for 39 episodes. Dennis won another passel of Emmys for the next 9 years. I was really proud of that. And then to be asked to join a show like the Larry Sanders Show. I had helped just write jokes for the fictitious monologues that Larry Sanders did. But to have Gary recognize something in me where he said, this guy is funny and I think he could benefit from some time here at the show. And I did the monologue jokes, and then I segued. I think I was season 4. I did a script with Judd Apatow that got on, and because of that script, I was staff on season 5. I may have the years wrong. I'm not sure. Yep. But yes, by then the show had been incredibly established. And what a show. I mean, it's Gary Shandling's show was just as revolutionary. Yes. So Gary had the rep as the cult guy, the guy out on the edge, who's recreating what television is. So to get asked to dive into that headstrong was an honor. I called it narrative camp. Yeah. It was just like summer camp. I would drive every day to work and watch Gary work and watch Peter Tolan work and watch Judd Apatow and John Rigi and John Vitti and these unbelievable writers with tremendous chops. Every day I would just sit like a fly on the wall and listen.
What was Judd like back then?
He was just, you could see the natural ability he had as a creative person and as a business person. He was the exact opposite of me emotionally. And I was in awe of his ability to talk to anyone and be at ease. The head of HBO would come in and I'd be like, oh my God, it's the head of HBO. All right, figure out how to say something. Maybe you can go, if he goes to craft service, maybe you can try to, and Judd would just go, hey, Michael, how are you? And I'd go, how do you do that? How is that even possible? And he's 21 or whatever the hell Judd was at the time. I had so much admiration for his understanding of human dynamics and his ease with them. And then you add on that the fact that he's a funny guy. And Judd and I wrote for Gary in tandem for a while, not on the show, but for all of Gary's award shows that he hosted and Grammys and things like that. And and I would do a lot of the monologue stuff, and Judd would do all the conceptual stuff and the sketches and stuff like that. So we wrote together for Gary for a long time, and I always admired his spirit too. And it wasn't just his youth. There's a bit of an old soul quality to Judd where, it'll be 3 a.m. and the room's dead and we're all been trying to scrape together something funny. And Judd will just come in and go, come on, let's think. It's 2 guys in a phone booth and the door won't open. Come on, let's go. And he just had that kind of your show of shows spark to him that I also always admired. So he was that way even back then. We're talking, 22, 23, 24 years. And Gary loved him because Judd just understood Gary right away, and Gary understood Judd, and they spoke that language. It's like in music, you get the right drummer. Yeah. There's 10 guys who are good enough to play the gig. It's not about the technique. It's not sometimes even about the feel. It's about what's behind the feel. Mm-hmm. And just, boy, I'm getting along with this guy off stage, on stage, and he's a great drummer. And he gets along with a guitar player who fucking nobody gets along with. Bam, you got your guy. And that's what Judd and Gary were. There was just a simpatico there. Peter Tolan as well. It was really that threesome. I think that really, truly helped shape Gary's vision for what the Larry Sanders Show was into another historically innovative show that I had the great good fortune to be part of. And then, like you say, that revolutionized sitcom for a long time, man.
Yeah. You said this thing earlier that I think is so crucial, like understanding that merit and talent is real and it will get you a long way. But there's all of these other ingredients, and depending on how, number one, which combination of those ingredients a person possesses, and number two, how willing one is to sort of acknowledge that, it can be also, I think, music certainly can. And I imagine comedy and writing and the career that you've had can feel this way, a little frustrating when those around you rise through the ranks at different rates and to different levels of success. And depending on the amount of ambition that a person has, also, it can be painful. I mean, what is it like to watch people around you as they sort of jockey for position in the business?
That's great. There really is a lot of parallels, and in a way, I'm fortunate. That's a great question, I should say. I'm fortunate that I kind of came out of jazz because I always enjoyed a lot of popular music too, and I always enjoyed funk. Yeah. So, regardless of funk and Latin music was I loved it, but coming from music, I knew there were so many great players who only rose to the middle, economically speaking, or from a business success definition. But I always thought, well, if they're making a quality living and they like it and they're living the life they want, who gives a crap? You don't have a yacht off Mykonos. Who cares? Yep. You're living the life you like and you're doing what you want to do. So that was kind of always my baseline. And then when I got into it, I really did see a lot of the elements that come in, and you have to step back and not take those personally. And that's the hardest thing. That is the hardest thing, is to not take that crap personally and to just go, it's all business. And you've got to adjust to that, and you can't let it become personal. You got to stay within yourself and hang with your own energy, and then function and try to accept these diverse elements and deal with them and use them to your advantage, but try not to beat yourself and let the bitterness drain right out, because bitterness is only you looking at somebody going, what's going on over there? Why are you looking at them?
Yeah.
You're just do your thing. And if you do your thing on 5 low, it's the one thing I wish I had learned more of when I was younger, is to not be afraid of the business side of show business. Mm-hmm. I came up in a different era, but still, if somebody demystifies that on an educational level, they're going to make $1 gazillion, and they probably already have. Show business, the business side of show business for artists is, is a great class somebody could teach.
Yeah, right.
To not be afraid, to use this shit to your advantage is really what's important.
It says it right in the name, show business. I mean, it's both, right? It's the show and there's a business. It's right there.
I remember, and there's that great Tom Petty documentary out, and they're talking to Tom Petty, and who's a tremendous artist and a massive commercial success.
Yes.
The late great Tom Petty. And in the documentary, someone asks him, do you ever feel like weird or so? I'm paraphrasing the question about being an artist, because they say true artists can't, achieve that level of commercial success or something like that. And Tom Petty just suddenly his eyes go kind of steely and he just looks at the guy and he said, literally, who the hell came up with that?
Yeah.
Meaning, no, you can have both. It just depends on the person, the circumstances, who you are. And that was, even though I only saw it 2 years ago, that was still a great lesson for me. It was still like, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. Was that, I don't know if he says it in that's an incredible documentary. I don't know if it's this, or if I saw it somewhere else, but it may be this moment where he's asked about selling out, and he says, isn't that the goal, to sell out? I mean, if you own a store, don't you want to sell out of the product? Why is it bad to sell out?
Yeah.
This idea that selling out is a negative thing as opposed to, isn't that what we're trying to do, is sell something?
Yeah, and to me, that's the beauty. I'm glad I'm around long enough to see it, and I hope to take advantage of it myself. The beauty of what's going on now is the dissemination, the decentralization of show business influence and power. There are people on TikTok, on YouTube, who are multimillionaires who neither of us even know. They got a platform, they got a following, they got a demographic, they're making money off it. That's the new business model. That's how that's going to go. Now, there's still going to be these crossovers. Can we take the guy from YouTube, the person from YouTube, and make him a big star in television or film? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe they haven't paid those kind of dues. But if the kid's making $3 million a year, do you care? I mean, at some point, YouTube, which they have now, has one of their networks is for their own movies that they're making. So they'll give the kid a movie. I mean, it's really kind of energizing and invigorating to see that the quote unquote gatekeepers are gone. There's some downside to that. But how many gatekeepers do you know from back then were really good? I mean, a lot of them are just fucking club owners.
Right. Oh, sure.
And in comedy, that's not saying, you can count on one hand the really good club owners in this country.
Well, it's interesting. It reminds me a little bit, though, of the conversation that I've been having with my dad for the last decade or so, where he's a real, he was an early adopter when it came to taking your career into your own hands, releasing things independently, paying for things and licensing them as opposed to holding out for somebody to, write the check for you. Like, he always said, don't wait for somebody to tell you know what you're doing. Just do the work. But he also had a couple of decades of a career in the old model that he was able to leverage and use. And you also, you have all your relationships and you have all of that experience in the sort of the world of the quote unquote gatekeepers that you're taking with you into the podcast outcast universe that you're in now in the sort of independent space. As you say, there are kids who didn't go through any of that shit that are able to make money. But on the other hand, in your world and in Ben's world, and mine even to some extent, you have all of that experience that you earned and did in the old model that you're able to bring with you.
Yes, that is a double-edged sword because it's a lot of skill and experience, but how much of it is usable in this new environment or where and when do you use it is tricky. And then you look around and like you say, the dues I paid, which was a good fortune to be able to pay dues that way. Somebody else is not having to pay those kinds of dues and is making big money without having to do it. But the trick for that is, to me, mazel tov, knock yourself out. If you get to a point, it's the Tom Petty theory. Fantastic. If you get to a point where somebody goes, okay, in the stand-up world, you only have 4 minutes and they're going to want to build a show around you. We've got to do something about that. Okay, cross that bridge when you get to it. You know, maybe you don't need those muscles anymore. You know, it's all different. They're paying dues on a different level. They're paying dues. I mean, you know, a young comic nowadays has to get up, deal with their own Twitter, their own TikTok, their own Facebook. Then they got to do their own 2 podcasts. Then they got to flesh out and do 3 other people's podcasts. Then they got to go over and do somebody's blog, a vlog. Then they're doing this. Then they're trying to get spots. They are doing everything for themselves and it is hard. So they're dues, but they're different kinds of dues. The smart ones, I believe, who think along the artistic creative bottom line of not what is stand-up even, but what is comedy. They're the ones who are going to keep at it creatively as well. So you're churning along in all 8 lanes of the pool if you're a comic nowadays, but you got to remember that one of them is still, what's funny? How do I make this funny for me? And if that lane's still going, you're fine.
Boy, that you might as well be talking about the music business. It's the same thing. And I always ask the same question. Like, okay, so I agree with you. The gatekeepers were not the hippest people to be making the choices. And in the case of music, it was an A&R person or an agent or somebody who, for whatever reason, said yes or said no. Sometimes they were right, sometimes they were wrong. But I think, would a Bob Dylan make it through this landscape today that is expected of young musicians? Because it's the same thing. You have to make your own music videos, put your own records out, book your own tours, be on Twitter, be on Instagram, be accessible on a level that so many of the great artists that came through the 60s and 70s wouldn't know how to be accessible. That's not what they were in the business of doing.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question, but it is rhetorical because we're no longer in that time. Yeah. And what audiences want changes. Yeah. And, and it should. Everything keeps moving forward creatively. So, would Dylan make it now as big as he's made it? I don't know. But I know this, he'd probably figure out a way to make a really comfortable living. Right. Because he's a bright, great artist, bright guy. Pretty good businessman, I mean, when you think about it, I don't care how big anybody wants to tell me folk music was in the early 60s. Yeah. This dude is a monster, man. He's lasted 4, 5, 6 decades in show business. You don't do that by plunking, blowing in the wind.
That's right. That's right.
Again and again and again. That's a smart man, Bob Dylan.
That's right.
So he would have figured out a way to make this work for him.
So, just to bring this home, you made a reference to your comedy record that you just put out this year, What Was I Thinking? And, you said earlier you were a little older when you first pivoted from music to comedy. You're 28. You went to Minneapolis. You then waited 39 years to put out a record.
Yeah. Well, I did. The first step a comic took back then was you get big enough, you do the Tonight Show, you do Letterman. Yeah. Then the cable companies come to you because they want you to do a special. Yes. So, and I got those deals, and I had good management, hustling management, and good hustling agents, and they really helped me get those deals. And I got 2 specials with Showtime, half-hour specials. Yes. Then I got, by 96, I did a special for HBO, 2005, I did a special for Comedy Central. So I had done 4 separate half-hour specials, all different material. So I'd done those kinds of things, but I'd never just done a pure comedy album, which is a whole different artistic groove.
How is it different?
Well, first of all, for me, it harkens back to what got me into comedy. Listening to Bob Newhart, listening to Mort Saul, watching those guys go on The Tonight Show and do 6 minutes and then push an actual album with cover art. Having loved jazz and loving the whole Blue Note thing and the whole Blue Note cover art. And there's just something to that I said, even if it's not going to be an album, it's still my album. Mm-hmm. So I always wanted to come out with that. And then I thought, wow, I don't feel, Leo, like I've hit my stride as a stand-up creatively until the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. I finally merged the great writing I learned early in my career and the sort of Leno, Seinfeld, Robert Klein school of great straight-ahead comedy writing, with what I learned from Gary Shandling, which was to be yourself as well. I learned third-person writing. Who are these people? What's going on over there? And then I coupled it with first-person writing, which is what Gary Shandling taught me, which is this happened to me, and here's what I did. Stupidly. And here's how I tripped up. But here's how I was still able to tell the store clerk they were a little bit of a goofball, to tell stories. And I didn't fully mesh those two styles, I don't believe, until this album. And it was the most fun I've ever had on stage. And I did old material, medium material, brand new material. Yeah. I did a tribute to my first Tonight Show where I did a line from my first Tonight Show on this album. And I did something I wrote that morning and just said, I got to take the shot. It's Saturday. It's show day. Let's try it tonight too. And it worked, and everything worked. I just had a great, great time at Acme Comedy Club in Minneapolis, which truly is one of the best rooms in the country.
Interesting. I heard the record and Spotify kept playing, and there you were in my ear because one of your former specials is also on Spotify. And I heard some of the same material as it had been rendered 15 years ago.
Right. Yeah.
And one of the things I noticed is that you started, it seems to me, working like entirely clean on this record. It's a clean record.
I intentionally did it completely clean. Talk about bringing it full circle as a business decision, because nowadays the way you monetize music and the way you monetize comedy is A, coming full circle, playing live. Mm-hmm. That's now the way you make money.
Yep.
Or B, brand new technology platform approach. You make your money by getting repetitive plays on the streaming services. Mm-hmm. If you have clean comedy, the library for clean comedy is only about 20% as big as the library for blue comedy on the Sirius XM comedy channels. So I thought, I'm going to get more plays if I keep it clean. Eventually, the channels that pride themselves on being cleaner are going to rotate me in more often. Yeah. And I thought, well, why not? I never did blue concepts. I generally just did blue language.
Yeah, you just drop in an F-bomb every now and then.
Yeah, I would say fuck or shit or whatever conversationally, because as we have mentioned, I came from southeastern Wisconsin, so that was kind of the way you grew up. There was a lot of swearing going around. So when I realized, oh geez, I mean, conceptually, I literally pulled out maybe 1 or 2 bits from my entire library of material.
Yeah,
and that doesn't even register. That didn't even make me sweat. The trick was no more conversational swearing.
Yeah.
And I just said, well, I can do that. Jeez, I've done my club act, and then the very next night had to do a Tonight Show where you're working clean. So that's an easy discipline for me. So I said, I'm working it clean for business, and I'm working it first person for creative to make it come out of me and my experience. And then I also had, as we were talking earlier, some areas of the chart where I soloed, where I went into the crowd, and I even included a couple of those.
I heard them.
I had so much fun.
One of the things I was wondering about was, I mean, I hear everything that you're saying makes perfect sense, and it's craft oriented, and I have a feeling that no outside personal elements would have made a difference. But I do know that maybe one of the most significant differences in your life between when you recorded your last special in 2005 or 2006 and today is that you have a young child. You have a daughter.
Yes, I have an 11-year-old daughter, and that will take the starch right out of you, man.
Yeah. Well, especially at your age, man. I got to give it to you. I don't know how you do it.
Yeah, I tell you, I do a riff on it. I didn't do it on the album, but I did some of it on the album. But it's a great, magnificent challenge. It's the best thing that ever happened to my wife and I, and she's the coolest kid in the world. And yeah, you do think like, hey, maybe I should improve my diet a little bit because I'd like to be around when she graduates high school. Maybe I should stay in shape.
Yeah.
That sounds interesting.
But it's not a reason to work clean though necessarily.
No, but it is in a way because she's really funny.
Yeah.
And, if there is an avenue that opens for her here, I would encourage her.
That is so interesting. You asked, I don't want to say you asked, Chet Waterhouse asked a question of me and my father. We were on Chet's podcast, Play with Pain. And, the question is, as a parent in show business or in entertainment, in music and comedy, whatever it is, what do you do when you're confronted with a child who looks like they might be interested in it also? And although my dad did encourage me, I mean, I should say he didn't discourage me. He never said, you got to do this. He just said, if this is what you want to do, then, all right, here we go.
Yeah.
But now here I am a generation later looking at, I have a 9-year-old daughter, and I mean, I'm not sure yet that that's going to be her path. But the one thing about the Gatekeepers model was there was at least a vision of what success could look like. And today it is really all over the map, and it's just so hard to know.
It is, and that is unsettling for a parent and probably exhilarating for an artist.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the silver lining you just have to keep looking at, or at least for me, that I try to keep looking at as a dad is wherever she lands, I'm going to be happy. Yeah. I don't care. I don't care. I really don't care. None of it I cared about. Do you want a boy or a girl? Don't care.
Yeah.
I just, it didn't really, you don't want a boy? No, I don't care.
Yeah.
I just want a great kid, and I'm going to do everything I can to help try to see that happens. And then to just realize how much I don't know about life and how big an idiot I actually am on some levels. And I don't say that disparagingly even. I just say, oh, I get it. I can't just say, hey, you have to listen to other people. I actually have to listen to what my daughter is saying and realize she's saying something really right and smart that's going to help me in this situation. As we talked about a little bit on Play with Pain, Ben and I especially grew up in a time when, kids were seen and not heard. Yeah. And, that's long gone. And we mentioned it on that podcast, and it's probably worth mentioning right here briefly, is that, the muscles I learned, the intrinsic muscles I have regarding raising a child are not only irrelevant now, they're illegal. Yeah. So my first and second reactions to any situation with my daughter are wrong. Yeah. And I got to get to that third reaction
quickly,
fast. Yeah. So knock on wood, I'll keep doing that.
Well, to just bring it all the way home, I guess I meant to ask you before, and I do want to ask you about Chet Waterhouse, because my understanding is that was a persona, a character, a bit that you were doing all the way back in Minneapolis.
Yeah, I did I loved sports, and when I was growing up, I just was not athletically inclined, which is another sliver that, which I believe is true, which is regarding some of the other artistic things we've been talking about, which is, yes, the American dream is work hard and you can achieve whatever you want. But I would suggest finding something, doing a little soul searching, and finding something you have an affinity for. Because then all that work is going to pay off triple fold.
Otherwise, you could be the fifth call drummer in Kenosha today. You could still be that guy.
Yes, I could. Exactly. Exactly. Which is not, nothing against the Kenosha scene.
Right.
So I had always loved sports announcers, even growing up. And I developed this character, and I called him Chet Waterhouse back in the early 80s in Minneapolis. And I remember the bit was sports announcers are so focused on sports that they could get the worst bulletin in the planet and it wouldn't even faze them.
Right.
Let's check the hockey results. Detroit flies by the Chicago Blackhawks 5-2. Hey, wait, this bulletin just in. Iran hit the buttons. We're in the middle of World War III. Just when the Red Wings were starting to turn it around. Oh, brother. Hey, but wait, maybe with that nuclear winter, we can skate outside year round. So I loved their enthusiasm and their ability to filter anything through the prism of sports. And that grew into Chet Waterhouse, and I did him in my stand-up. And then I did them on my specials, and then I started doing them on radio out here at the famous KROQ, K-Rock out here, and developed him slowly. And then finally, when this whole podcasting thing hit, I just went, well, I'm not going to do a podcast. There's too many people. We mentioned Mark Maron, there's Joe Rogan, Adam Carolla. There's so many people out there who do great podcasts in depth with comedians and show business people.
Yep.
And, do we need another one of those? And I just thought, well, Chet might be.
Yeah.
So I just thought, let me build something around Chet that is completely Chet-like. The energy is high. Yeah. The energy doesn't stop. The commercial endorsements, these idiot commercial endorsements. Hey, it's brought to you by Throwbacks, the e-cigarette you light with a match.
Yep.
Just keep coming. As you experience the pace, even though we're getting this stuff in the interview, the pace is still quick. And I wanted to do that and have be in and out in 30, 35 minutes.
Yep.
And I thought, let me see if I can't do something with that and maybe get some traction. So I'm glad you guys came on. It was a blast, and you guys were hilarious.
I was such a treat to be on Play with Pain, and I'm so glad that it also opened up a chance for you and I to have this long overdue conversation that really, I think, just is the tip of the iceberg. And I really do hope that we at some point can make good on these ideas that we've had over the years to try to find where to bring music and comedy together. I mean, I know it happens in LA. There are places where it happens in New York. I don't see it happening. And I don't think that those worlds should be so siloed, because I think that there is something in the mentality of the people anyway that is like very related. They're cousins, I'd love to try to do something with you one day.
We'll do, we'll call it the new opera, popular music with comedy. We'll definitely figure it out. Thanks for having me on, man. What a blast.
Jeff Cesario, thanks so much, man. And be well. I'll talk to you soon.
You got it.
There he was, Jeff Cesario. What a fun talk. I mean, what can you say? It was there. He laid it out for us. And when he put it down, whap, it stayed down. I'll be back again before you know it with another deep dive. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.